It is that time of year again where we talk about the Grammys. Grammy season is upon us. In the next few hours or so, the actual Grammys will be hosted. As of recording this video, we are not far away from it at all. And as it is tradition, we moan and whinge about the Grammys every single year. So I thought I'd do a video on the Grammys again. We pretend we don't care about it, but we clearly do. So this week's tier list video for you is ranking 40 albums that won Album of the Year at the Grammys in a nice tier list. Thought it would be a nice little fun thing to do. So I picked out 40 albums that I thought were significant, thought they were important, or maybe there was something interesting to say. I haven't picked every single Grammy winner ever. That would have just been too long. So I picked out 40, thought that was a good amount. And I'm going to rank them in a tier list, and you can agree with me, disagree with me, and decide what you think in the comments as you usually do. And if you massively hate what I say, which is fair enough, you can make your own tier list and click the link in the description. It'll take you to the tier list and you can make your own. You can send it on social media to me, Instagram, Twitter, whatever you follow me on. And yeah, we can keep the discussion going over there. So that's basically the premise of the video. Let's not really waste any time. Let's go. Tier list is right in front of me here. So we're just going to get straight on with it. Adele, 21. I think this was a very good album. I'm sure I've spoke about some of these before. You may be getting repeated opinions coming up here, but I suppose in context with the Grammys, it's interesting to talk about what it was up against or what the year looked like for music and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think Adele's 21 was a very good album. I still think it's one that I think has aged pretty well. It's still got some of her best songs ever on it, really. I don't know if she'll really ever come close to topping it, if I'm being totally honest with you, because I don't really think 25 was that great. It's got some really good songs on it, don't get me wrong. Friggin' When We Were Young is absolutely stunning. What a song that is. That might still be my favourite of hers, but Hello is really dire and dull. I just don't ever find myself getting into that. And I think she just ended up relying way too much on her vocals as her career went on. Like, obviously she's an amazing singer, but what else have you got to your game? And I just think 25 was a good indicator of that starting to show up, where it was like, oh, actually you're relying a lot on these vocals now, and the songs themselves just don't really have that much to them that really interests me. But 21 has a lot of that on there. Really good album. And yeah, 25 winning against Beyonce was a pretty controversial thing. It just wasn't Album of the Year that year for sure. Controversial one here. It is kind of sad to be saying this, to be honest with you, because I think there's a lot about Alanis Morissette that I should like, but it's her voice that I think she's just doing way too much with. I know a lot of people are going to be looking at this thinking you're crazy, because it's a beloved album, and you can see why it won the Album of the Year. But apart from You Ought to Know, and maybe Ironic, depending on the mood I'm in, there isn't much from this album I can really get on board with. I just think when she's doing that, every single line, every single word just gets enunciated to death. It's just too much, man. Oh my god. I talked a little bit in a TikTok recently, you should follow me over on TikTok of course, about how Arcade Fire generally have grown off me massively, and I think the sour taste that was left in my mouth after Everything Now and everything that they've put out since that album has just been like, no, they just aren't doing it for me anymore, really, that much. Although The Suburbs, I can say, is a good album. Don't get me wrong, it is a good album. But yeah, just can't really fully get on board with what they do now. There's some amazing tracks on here, though. The Sprawl is incredible, absolutely amazing song. But yeah, as an album, you know, it was a pretty shock win. And I like the fact that an album like this can win, because it shouldn't just always be about the best-selling album of every year. Although some people seem to believe that should be how it is, but I don't agree with that. I think it should be about the content of the album and how good the music is. They just could have probably picked something a little bit more interesting than The Suburbs, but you can't really go massively wrong with this if you're an Arcade Fire fan. I think a lot of people would probably have this higher up. But yeah, beyond a few tracks that really stand out, I think most of it's just decent. It's a solid album. Yeah. Beck's Morning Phase? No. No, thank you. Let's move that. It's not moving. No, just do not get with Beck here. What? Again, what it was up against and what could have won is just mad. Like maybe a bit of a longitudinal sort of like, you've done a lot in your career, Leonardo DiCaprio moment, you know, let's give you this one because it's more of your like singer-songwriter personal album, even though he already did this on Sea Change years before. But yeah, it's just really bland, uninspired sounding stuff to me. I can't really get with what Beck was doing on this album at all. There is a world for this kind of music, just not sung by Beck, because he's just a bit of a bland singer, isn't he? Bonnie Raitt shockingly won a few years ago, Song of the Year I think it was, and she looked shocked herself. She looked more shocked than everyone else, to be honest. But back in the day, she was putting out some really solid country rock music. I mean, Real Man is cheesy as hell on this album. I can't get with that song, but yeah, it's a solid little fun. She's kind of just having a bit of cheeky fun throughout this album. Some really rocking tunes, some country-based stuff too. It's a nice combination of styles here. I'm okay with this. It's a decent album. Is it Album of the Year winning worthy though? Maybe a conversation for another day. I do like what Bruno Mars was giving us on 24 Karat Magic. He essentially just embraced the fact that actually funky soul throwback music is just everything that we wanted to hear from him after Uptown Funk. And he gave us that. He delivered. Finesse, what a tune. Yeah, quite a funny win, because obviously a lot of people were absolutely shocked to see this win over like something like a Lorde or a Kendrick, because it seemed like they were the ones that were going to win this year. But of course, again, he is commercially successful and easily the biggest name out of all the winners, all the nominees, sorry. But yeah, it just was one of those random wins where it was like, I think people wouldn't have minded seeing Kendrick win. Like, I don't think anyone would have been particularly mad if Bruno Mars didn't win, to be honest with you. Carole King, Tapestry. Beautiful little album here. Maybe very good, if I'm being honest, actually. I think I need to be fair with this one. I think there's a nice amount of lovely vocal, warm singing on this album that comforts me, you know? It's just a really comforting album. And It's Too Late. It's Too Late is an all-timer right there. That is still one of my favourite songs ever. So to have that on your album, I can't get mad at you winning. Christopher Cross, I think, is solid enough. Probably lowest of the decents, to be honest with you. With me, with Christopher Cross, I think when you look at the context of when it won and what won before it and what started to win after it, there was a bit of a sea change that commenced with, we'll get to it in a bit, it's literally 2 away, Rumours by Fleetwood Mac. And you can see that album winning and them establishing themselves as a pretty legendary artist in the game just created so many artists that wanted to kind of mimic that vibe, that sound, that soft rock sort of chilled out, really happy-go-lucky sound that was accessible enough for radio, but also had a bit of like a rock element enough to it. And I think a lot of people wanted to be like the next Stevie Nicks or wanted to be the next Fleetwood Mac. And you can see for like the next 10 years, the winners at the Grammys are like all kind of like birthed from Fleetwood Mac. It's quite funny. And this album here, Christopher Cross, it very much indicative of that. A pretty safe, bland sounding album to win Album of the Year. I can't imagine how there couldn't have been better albums that year that came out that should have won over it, really. But it's nice. Like, I can't put it below anything that isn't decent. It's a solid album. That track, Riding on a whatever that one is, that was a good song. But yeah, just really chilled, soft yacht rock type music, yacht rock or whatever you want to call it. You've heard it before. You've heard it done better, though, as well. So I like Daft Punk's Random Access Memories. Looking back, it makes sense that this won. But I think, again, at the time, it was a bit of like, ooh, this one won? Oh. But nah, you can see why it did. Daft Punk, legends in the game, kind of came through pushing the boundaries of what they could do with their sound with tracks like Touch, and kind of went to essentially write a love letter to the 70s with this album too, with tracks like Get Lucky or some of the other tracks that have Pharrell on, and the funkiness of some of the tracks too. You can see exactly how they would appeal to the Grammys with this album. It was good. I do like it. Never loved it as much as other people do though, so maybe for me, you know, I'm not absolutely head over heels for what they were doing on the album, because I still find tracks like Doing It Right a bit boring. But overall, it's Daft Punk, and this could easily be considered their best album, so not really angry at this one winning. Yeah, now we're on to Fleetwood Mac, which was what I was saying before, where the AOTYs just seem to suddenly want to be Fleetwood Mac because so many winners after this one sound similar to this album. It's mad. But yeah, this is the cream of the crop. This is as good as it gets for classic 70s rock, if you want to call it that. Some amazing tracks on it. Dreams, the dude with the cranberry juice on that TikTok. I mean, he encapsulates us all. We all feel that way when we listen to Dreams. There's a bit of cheese. A bit of cheeky amount of cheese on this album for sure. You know, Don't Stop. Bit of cheese, a little bit of cheese. That's not to hate on the album. It's still the highest so far out of all the albums, but it's a little bit cheesy at times. But yeah, some amazing tracks. I actually think the opening track, Secondhand News, is kind of underrated, honestly. I don't love it when the guy sings that isn't Stevie. I always forget what his name is. I feel a bit bad for doing that. But yeah, when he sings, he's obviously not as good as Stevie. But I like what they bring to the table on this album. It's timeless. It still sounds as good as it ever did. Yeah, absolutely love it. You Make Loving Fun. Still my favourite track on the album. So there you go. George Michael, Faith. A few albums here where I'll probably repeat myself and say the singles are good, but the album itself is just a bit whatever. And this is exactly that. I mean, it's fine, I guess, but I don't know, man. It just never committed to memory when I listened to this, really. Stan Getz. So what I want to say about this album is I probably should like it more than I do. But I think realising when I was going back to it a little bit earlier today was like some of the vocal performances are just a bit too low-key, but the music itself sounds really good. And yeah, I just think it lacks a bit of oomph. It's a really cool winner, though, for an album of the year. I mean, back in the 60s, it makes sense for something like a jazz-adjacent album to win, because that was obviously the sign of the times. For a lot of jazz music was kind of at its peak at that point, so it makes sense. But yeah, for me, Jazz Samba is the one. That's the Stan Getz album that gets me going, man. That is the Stan album that gets me going. Glenn Campbell, By the Time I Get to Phoenix, not to be mistaken with Injury Reserve, is solid. It's alright. I don't know, it's just one of those country albums for me that, like, maybe similar to what I was saying about Stan Getz, like, it lacks a bit of oomph. Like, there's not enough that grabs me or grips me throughout the whole runtime of the album, although it's a pretty short album. But yeah, I still would like a little bit more excitement, or maybe a bit of grit coming through from my country music. You need a really, really sensational voice to keep me invested, like a Laurie McKenna. If you're going to do this kind of stripped back country, you're going to have to really grip me with your vocals, and a Laurie McKenna would do that with her music. But this is okay. It's, you know, it's alright. Harry's House, still one of the most silly wins in the history, really, of the Grammys, because it just shouldn't have beaten Beyonce, really. But of course, you know, when you look at the history of what won throughout the Grammys, you can see not much has changed. A little bit has changed, but not much has changed. And this Harry Styles win is essentially like Christopher Cross winning. Like, it's just the safest, blandest album that came out that year, that doesn't really push anything in terms of boundaries or change anything up, but it's appealing enough to your average Grammy committee voter that they'd stick it on in the background and enjoy it, because it's just simple sounding stuff, isn't it, really? And that's not to sound pretentious. It probably does come across pretentious, but even like in comparison to other albums from like singer-songwriters or pop artists, you know, Harry Styles just isn't doing enough here. There just isn't enough for me to really get excited about. As it was, I like, give that the award, but you don't need to give the whole album the award, you know what I mean? Late Night Talking is still my favourite track on the album, actually. Again, give that an award, but you don't need to give the whole album the award. Like the tracks like Cinema and stuff are just like not interesting at all. Yeah, just a baffling one. Speaking of baffling wins, we got a few in a row coming up. We may as well knock these out of the park, because as much as I will say that Herbie Hancock winning was absolutely bizarre, it is actually a decent album. But this is bizarre for so many reasons, and I'm going to talk about the context of this, because what it was up against, like, it was up against some big hitters. Some big hitters. It's like massive hitters, honestly. But the fact that years and years after his peak, his best days, he gets a Grammy win for an album that he is doing like a love letter to Joni Mitchell and basically doing like cover tracks and stuff. For an artist who is a legend in the game, but also never won during her peak. Like, she never won in the 70s, and Herbie Hancock never won in the 70s either. So this is like essentially a double sort of apology win. Like a double sort of, oh, we should have given you this back when you were in your best days, but we never gave it you then. So now you're doing this. We'll give you this. And also, it's like an apology to Joni Mitchell too. Baffling, man. Baffling. This in no world is an album of the year winner. I again, shows how the Grammys will never change really, because the sound of this album just encapsulates everything that they would give a Grammy to really. But goddamn, like Blue, Joni Mitchell's Blue never won a Grammy, like, and yet this does. And Herbie Hancock's like Headhunters, which is a great jazz album as well, never won. Like, come on. One of the biggest shocks of the past few years as well, Jon Batiste. It's just like, it's the kind of music I like. Like, I want to like this album, but he just brings nothing to the table with the sound here. Again, typical for the Grammys to give something that is so ordinary and beige sounding the album of the year. I don't know why this always happens. Like, I'm just trying to think of like the age range maybe of the people that vote, or just if they even pay attention to music throughout the year, and they maybe just thought, oh, this is actually something that we wanted to see more of. We want to see more traditional soul and R&B come back to the mainstream. So maybe if we give it this, it'll highlight that. But yeah, like, Michael Kiwanuka's right there. Like, why did we give it to Jon Batiste? I don't know. I don't know. All right, so Casey Musgraves, I've got to confess here, I've always really liked Golden Hour. It's very, very plain at times, and her writing, it could be better. Her writing could definitely... If writing has been better, her writing was better on her first album, actually. But it's pop and country combining. It's an accessible sound. I'd like her enough to appreciate what she was doing on this album. It's quite lovely. Slow Burn is a really good track. But yeah... again, a bit of a shock outside win. Got to go with Miseducation of Lauryn Hill next. Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, can't really argue with, just combines neo-soul and hip-hop in the really most lush way we may ever really witness. Like, she can rap, she can sing very, very well, she can write music really well. Yeah, a lot of people would probably put this on all-timer, and I wouldn't argue with you, or maybe at the very least excellent. I personally have never quite loved the album that much. I still think it's really good though. But yeah, I can't really argue with this winning album of the year. This is definitely one of those where it's like, you know what, can anybody really complain that this one? I can't really find any reason to moan that this one album of the year, to be honest with you. I can for the next one though, Lionel Richie. Right, so maybe a generational gap here, because if you speak to anybody that's like, what, in their 40s, 50s, maybe pushing 50 actually, we might have to go a little bit higher up in the age range here. They love Lionel Richie. Like, Lionel Richie is that kind of mum, dad core music. People loved him at the time. So this winning at the time probably made a lot of sense. Just going back and listening to the album though, it's just like really cheesy and just really like plain ballad music. All Night Long's a bit of a tune, I'll give it that, but yeah, just really not an exciting listening album at all, listening experience at all. MJ, very good. Again, people would probably put this on all-timer, but for me, the all-timer in his discography has got to be Off the Wall. That is the one for me, that is that good. But Thriller winning, I mean, obviously, yeah, it's like one of the most groundbreaking pop albums ever. It's pretty much the biggest selling album ever too. I think at one point it was, I don't know if the Eagles surpassed it. I might have to look at the stats on that one. But even still, it's ridiculously revered. Everybody knows the singles from this album. This one makes sense because it's like the music is really bloody good, and commercially it like is off the charts. So a great combination of an actual lifelong, timeless album that has songs that still to this day sound incredible, but also at the time it was like the biggest thing in the world. So it's pretty good that they gave it this one, actually. You can't really make any mistakes with giving that album of the year. You can make mistakes with giving Mumford & Sons album of the year, though. Bad. Yeah. Beating Channel Orange, I think, as well. Whoa. Wow. Okay. And not to be that guy, but like, you don't really come across people that are absolutely in love or obsessive over Mumford & Sons like a decade later, whereas Frank Ocean has built up a cult of people that are like desperate to hear more music. They really could have got this right. They may as well have given it to Frank that year, because like he's lasted all these years and still, without putting out an album for like 8 years now, is still beloved. But Mumford & Sons aren't really like talked about now. The banjo friggin' shit, man, I can't cope with it. It's just so cringe. Fleet Foxes did a lot of damage to the modern day of folk music, because they inspired stuff like this, and it's regretful. Norah Jones, can't really go wrong with this album. I might put it at the top of the decent, actually. It's a lovely vocal jazz album. And when you look at historically as well, like what won in the 2000s, the fact that this won, and then, 10 years later, Adele won. And in between those two albums, we had Amy Winehouse that somehow didn't win. You got to kind of wonder how that happened, because it's exactly the kind of album that they clearly want. They clearly wanted vocal jazz throwback music, and they gave it to Norah Jones. They gave it to Adele. They did not give it to Amy Winehouse, which is a shame. But still, the opening track and Come Away With Me, incredible songs. Just think the rest of the album doesn't quite live up to those two songs, but still really good. This is going to be one of the first hot takes of the evening or the day or whatever, because I'll put it at the top because there's some amazing songs on here. But Outkast, Speakerboxxx, The Love Below, particularly The Love Below, to me is just like really dated sounding, and I can't really get on board with the writing on that part of the album. The production as well just is really off to me. I'm just not on board with this album on the whole. Hey Ya, Roses, The Way You Move. It's really a singles heavy album, if I'm being honest, because they are quite comfortably the best songs on it. But for a double album, and for it to be Outkast's like big moment, I find it underwhelming. I was pretty shocked listening to tracks like Spread, that I was just like, this is bad. Like, I couldn't quite believe it. But can see why it won. It was commercially successful. It was the time where hip-hop was really making its meteoric rise to the charts in a way that we hadn't quite seen before. There was some of it in the 90s, but I think the 2000s, with things like 50 Cent and Kanye, and obviously Outkast too, it was like really becoming like a big thing. But I just think the album's pretty weak comparatively to the rest of their work too. Alright, let's keep going. Don't want to overdo it with the amount of talking I'm doing here. Let's just get on with it. Graceland, want to love this album more. I think for me, the melodies could be stronger on this album. Like, it's a good album, but like sometimes some of the tracks just don't quite have like something to drive the song. Apart from You Can Call Me Al, which is just an absolute banger. I think all the tracks should have sounded like that, to be honest. Bill Collins is alright. It's decent. Some pretty weak tracks for me on this album. But it's very of its time. It sounds pretty 80s. It sounds pretty dated, to be honest. Like, when you look at the 80s and think what could have won Album of the Year, and you think of something like Tears for Fears or Purple Rain, like, they were quite obviously pulling ideas from the new sort of wave of 80s pop music and how music shifted in that time period. And like, Tears for Fears could have won Album of the Year easily. So, this is an alright album, but I just think comparatively it sounds a little dated. Some of the drumming, some of the production's a bit ham-fisted in places. It's got some good tunes on it, don't get me wrong. But yeah, I just think looking back at like what could have defined that era, I don't know if this album does, to be honest. I'm not even going to say anything on this album, because what the hell happened here? Like, why did Raising Sands win Album of the Year? I don't know, man. And what's sad to say about Santana here is I actually think their Abrascus album is really bloody good, and it utilises all of the best qualities of the guitar playing, because that's quite clearly one of the strong suits of Santana. But Supernatural for me is bloody long and bloody uninteresting for the most part. Like, apart from those two singles, Maria Maria and Smooth, I just had nothing nothing to enjoy from this album when I listened to it. Maybe a bit of a hot take here, but Sgt. Pepper's going in decent. I listened to this again recently because it's been ages, but I'm a massive Beatles fan. I absolutely love the Beatles. And for me, I was like struggling to pick out any tracks that really sort of like reached out to me on this album, because so much of it just feels like it's trying to, I mean, it is obviously pushing boundaries with its experimentation, some of the psychedelic stuff, but then you've got that like Arabian instrumental on that one track that just sounds really stupid and like pointless, and just like, why are they doing this? You can tell they were just on a lot of drugs for this album, and I don't know if this album's aged on the level of some of their best work. I think it's all right, and I think Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and A Day in the Life is, you know, fantastic, but both fantastic songs, by the way. But yeah, just I think the whole thing doesn't come together. It's great that Beatles did get one Album of the Year win, but for me, I think when you look at like Revolver or Abbey Road, or even maybe a Rubber Soul would have been cool to see win Album of the Year, man. Like, I don't know, Sgt. Pepper's for me what is the revered Beatles album that I've never quite fully got. Like, I just don't know if it's quite on that level for me. I just yeah, there's just not many tracks that stand out in a way that a lot of Beatles albums have, like all the tracks standing out, and you can play it any time and get loads of enjoyment out of. But this album doesn't quite have that for me. Bridge Over Troubled Water is a very good album. Not really a hot take there. I think actually the If I Could second track is the best song on this album. Of course, the two that everyone knows are Cecilia and Bridge Over Troubled Water. But yeah, maybe a little front-loaded, this one, because if you look at the album, the first 5 was the side A of the vinyl, and then side B had 6 tracks. But side A is like ridiculously good. Like, it's so good, side A. And then side B is like decent. So I think maybe just the sign of the times, vinyl and how they did things back then, maybe just a little front-loaded. All right, let's just get these all out of the way. All-timer, excellent. All-timer, like Stevie Wonder. In fact, that's the top of the list. All-timer for sure. They got it so right with Stevie Wonder, and Stevie Wonder's music has lived on to this day, and I'm a massive Stevie fan, one of my favourite artists of all time. And even that bias aside, I mean, how can Innervisions not be an all-timer? How can Songs in the Key of Life not be an all-timer? I still to this day do not know a single person that has heard Songs in the Key of Life that did not like it. It is a truly universal album that speaks to so many people. It truly is ridiculously good. And yeah, the fact that he got so many in quick succession, the Grammys took wins there. They knew that Stevie was on another level, and it's great to see that it was recognised. Noticing a theme here, aren't you? Lots of decent and meh, but not too many excellents or all-timers. And if you've watched any of my tier lists before, I can be pretty generous with my ratings. I tend to have a lot of excellents, quite a few all-timers, and many very goods. But not so much this time around, and that is not going to change. Because whether people will agree with this or not, I don't know. But I think 1989 is decent. I actually think Fearless is very good. I think it's still one of her best albums, and maybe a little underrated, to be honest with you. And then Folklore is, yeah, I think Folklore should be a bit high up. There's some really good tracks that have grown on me from Folklore, actually, like August. I think that's a really lovely track. But yeah, I mean, Taylor having 3 Album of the Years, to me, is still kind of mad. Like, when you compare it to Stevie, who is just an absolute expert at crafting incredible albums. Whereas Taylor, I don't think has ever really been on that level, to be honest with you. But to have as many as Stevie is still a little baffling to me. There's some great tracks in her catalogue. There's some really amazing moments. She, has some great albums I actually really like, read a lot. But for me, I don't know, man. I think there's weak tracks on every single album that drags them down. So yeah, I don't know. Taylor is a phenomenon, of course, and is the biggest artist of our time. And maybe once this video's out there, she'll have a 4th Grammy. But I just don't know if the music's on that level of quality. I think it's easy to give her the win because it pleases a lot of people. But I just think when we look back on her albums in like 15 years' time, will we really view these as legendary albums? I mean, an album with Shake It Off and Bad Blood on it, can they really be considered that great? I don't know, man. U2, never really been the biggest fan of. Just going to put them in there. I want to like U2, but I can't for some reason. Maybe needs to keep going back to that album. That's going to be one that people probably will not enjoy seeing me do. Toto, yeah, they're fun. Again, soft rock, kind of casual, easy listening music with Africa at the end of the album, which is an all-timer track that everybody loves. But yeah, this was what I was saying before with Fleetwood Mac having that kind of influence, because again, that kind of soft rock, sort of casual, easy breezy sound is all over this album, with a few roaring guitars to throw in it every now and then. But yeah, you can see that they were trying to replicate what Fleetwood Mac did in the 80s and give album of the years to albums that sound kind of adjacent to it. I like Billie Eilish's style, just like Isaac said in Black Country New Road. I like her approach, I like her vision, I like her creativity, but this album for me is just decent. It's cool. It's a cool album. I like it. I enjoy it. But yeah, I don't know. Just think, for me, like the potential was there with this album. I didn't think she quite knocked it out of the park on first go. I always thought the potential to take this sound even further was really apparent. And then she did Happier Ever After. Happier, whatever that one's called. Happier, yeah. And she just ditched all of the creativity and just kind of gave a singer-songwriter bland ballad album that was just kind of whatever to me. But I was interested to see if she'd do more stuff like Bury a Friend and kind of tidy that sound up and do some interesting things with that. But she never really did. So this album for me will always kind of be in that chasm, that sort of like, it's there to expand on and do great things with, but the actual product of what she gave us on that album is just all right. And The Bodyguard, to finish things up, a soundtrack to a film that Whitney Houston has a lot of control over with the songs, etc., etc. Just so random to win Album of the Year, honestly. But not only that, I can't even remember half the track list. Like, obviously everybody knows I Will Always Love You, which is a really powerful performed cover, of course, of who is it by? Dolly Parton. Yeah, and that's a incredibly performed song. Then of course I'm Every Woman, which again is a cover, Shaka Khan. On this album too, great songs, both of those, absolutely. But the rest of it, I mean, can anybody even remember the rest of this album? Like, if you grew up during this time, do you even know what was on this album, or do you just remember those two songs? I don't know, a bit of a random winner there, really. Not that I'm against soundtracks winning, but it does feel a little like, I mean, I absolutely love the film Chicago. Would I say it should win Album of the Year at the Grammys, though? No, but it is probably one of the best musical film soundtracks ever. I still don't know if it should win Album of the Year, though. It's just a bit random, innit? Right, anyway, that is it. I've spoke for absolutely ages. I have ranked 40 Album of the Year winners in a lovely, nice little neat tier list that is quite clearly bottom heavy this time compared to my usual ones, which might say a lot about the Grammys, if we're being honest with you here. If we're being honest with ourselves, if we're being honest with each other, it might say a lot about the Grammys. Lots of lots of decent stuff that wins. Nothing absolutely terrible, though. The closest to that is really Mumford & Sons. But even still, like, you know, they never get it terribly wrong. They just seem to pick out albums that just aren't really that inspiring or interesting, or yeah, I don't know, just just an interesting list of albums here. Of course, there were plenty more winners that I haven't talked about. Let me know your thoughts though. You can talk about all of this in the comments if you agree with me, disagree. There's a few disagreeable takes I think here, quite a few actually, that I think people probably hound me for. But yeah, that is it from me. Create the tier list yourself as well. Click the link in the description. Send it to me over on Instagram, Twitter, whatever you want to do. Have a good day and enjoy the Grammys tonight. If you're watching, do any of you watch that? Probably not. Have a good day. Goodbye.